too.
We are to put in the chat as well to try to agree, or don't
yes, yes, yes.
Oh.
Well, good morning. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, too. We are opening our second session of the 2022 seminar, Archives and Collections. It is a seminar, it's a year seminar. It is connected to the project, collective project sponsored by the FAPERJ, it's our state foundation here in Rio. It's a collective project that engages many institutions, such as our university, Universidade Federal Fluminense, Unirio, and National Archive and State Archive. And it is a project that wants to connect archives, photograph collections, and historical research. So today we have our very, very lovely guest, Patrícia Hayes, from Cape Town. And I would like to thank you, Patrícia, for your participation. And today, as usual, Marcos Oliveira, who is my partner in this organization, will present you, and then we'll have this. You have an hour to make your presentation, and then we have a short break, and then Paulo and Milton will be introduced by Marcos, and we have commentaries from them, and then we will open the session for our audience. We have also here John Ras, who's a very good fellow from Mexico, an important researcher in photography. I have this book here. I dedicated. It's a wonderful to have you all here. It's just great. We are among friends. Okay, so Marcos, the stage is yours. You're a master of ceremony.
Okay, in the second session of our seminar, we have communication from Patrícia Hayes. Patrícia Hayes is a historian, a professor of visual history and theory at the Center Unit Research of the University of the West Cape, and her research examines African history, gender history, and visual history. She is the co-author of the Colonizing Camera and Bush of God's Life and War in Namibia. She edited, together with Gary Minklin, the book Ambivalent Photograph and Visibility in African History. This book's very, very good. She's also the author of a number of book chapters and journal articles. We are thankful for your step into our seminar, Patrícia. Now the word is with you.
Your microphone, Patrícia, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Marcus, for that lovely welcome. And I want to express my great appreciation for this invitation and this opportunity also to reconnect with some wonderful colleagues that I have had conversations with in the past, such as Milton Guran and also Paulo Knauss. So I'm really delighted and thank you very much. So my talk is about colonial and archival partitions, and my work is centered on the border region between northern Namibia and southern Angola. And today I'm going to start, I must say, with some difficult photographs, which are the postmortem photographs of the last king of Kwanyama, Mandume Yande Murfayo. So I'm going to show those first, or at least I'm going to ask Anna to show them for me as I start talking. So I want to present a problem And I would really welcome the feedback on some of the problems that I am finding with these photographs. I'm very interested in what those of you who are very familiar with photography might have to say. So let me start. After the South African military expedition, which was sent to remove this troublesome king of Kwanyama, Mandume Yandemufayo, it completed its mission on the 6th of February 1917, and a significant number of photographs were produced of the king's dead body on the battlefield at a place called Oihole. And Anna, you can show the first slide, please. Numbers of these prints have surfaced in libraries, family albums, or at auction. It would appear that multiple prints were made of particular frames and distributed amongst members of the expedition, as well as officials in the Native Affairs Department. You can go to the next slide, Anna. Some of these were published in newspapers and magazines. Now, it's not clear precisely who took the photographs and whether this was under official instruction with a specific purpose in mind, or whether these were amateur efforts that were shared. Thus, we know certain people ended up with photographic prints and kept them for their own private purposes. But we do not know who actually held the camera or cameras, because some photographs show the presence of people with cameras. Nor do we know how, when, and where the negatives were developed into positives and then shared across this group of men. Typically, therefore, while it is possible to view albums and look at the images with particular captions given to them, often in typescript, sometimes handwritten, no information about their actual production and distribution accompanies these objects. Close, we could almost say forensic examination of these photographs that have surfaced over the decades suggests an unsettling series of documented actions after the battle. When found, the king's body was extracted from the others and brought to the commanding officer, Colonel de Jager, lodged precariously on a makeshift hurdle. And you can go to the next slide. In what follows, the apparent imperative was to produce an incontrovertible identification photograph of the dead king. And this is where it gets very interesting, for it appears that the actual prone body, and we can go to the next slide, Anna, defeated the perspectival construction of the camera box. And I want to suggest that it calls into question a number of the ways we think about photographs, archives, and history. So the camera recorded at an angle that distorted proportion, enlarging what was close and diminishing what was distant. Next slide. The compromise was to lever or prop up the head, which was standard practice for hunting trophy shots, often using a leather strap. But this was the body of the king. The buckling, the bending of linear perspective by the lifeless body required soldiers to manhandle Mandume. And this has led to some radical understandings of what happened after the battle at Oihole. Now, the publication of this particular photograph you see here in a popular periodical in Namibia I think it was in the 60s, which lots of people kept. That publication prompted the Namibian artist John Mwafangejo to produce a lino cut. Next slide. And this lino cut portrays Corporal Moroni literally cutting off the king's head. So in a way, this is the failure of the camera, a kind of structural ambivalence, producing a polarized reinterpretation that forcibly confronts the colonial meta-narrative with the specter of its own violence. This is important because with demands made for the return of Mandume's head from the South African government at the end of the colonial occupation by South Africa in 1990, it is a case where instead of a photograph needing context, the photograph itself produces the context and pushes history in a certain direction. It adds to accusations against colonists of violent atrocity. Next slide, Anna. Okay, now, how do we come here and how do we start to think about some of these questions? And this necessitates an outline of how I'm trying to work with photographs in relation to multiple archives. It also necessitates an excursion into southern Angola in the early 20th century, and that's what this talk will attempt to do. Next slide, Anna, please. Thank you. So while these photographs, these post-mortem photographs seem to collapse time, I also want to argue that they let us extend time, opening up spaces of inquiry into the long inception of colonialism itself in this part of Africa. Now, my larger project is to probe whether new modes of reading photographs might be able to connect us in unexpectedly rich ways with Africa's more distant past. Efforts to reconstruct earlier histories in sub-Saharan Africa that began in the 1960s left behind a distinguished but much debated field, especially in the study of oral history and tradition. As this research on oral tradition has tapered off, so has productivity around what has been termed the pre-colonial. In fact, what we call the source, the oral, appears to be overlapping and almost consonant with the periodization pre-colonial, as if both are clear-cut. This hiatus has added to expressions of a general sense of difficulty around the historical record for Africa's earlier eras. The default explanation coming back to the relative lack of written archives. Now, when disciplines such as political science, history, interdisciplinary areas like development studies have tended to focus on the histories of colonialism and post-colonial Africa, questions of more distant historical epochs are increasingly left by the wayside. As the historian Richard Reed has noted, this results in a foreshortening of centuries of history and an expansion of the more recent past. Now, as debates intensify around imperial plunder, decolonization, and post-colonial restitution, there is even more impetus to remain focused on the colonial. My concern is that we are in danger of being left with little else but the colonial. This is why I put the question, is it possible to push back time from the scenario? And can photographs help us to do so? Can we especially steal time from those antechambers of history, those threshold spaces in Africa that saw a longer inception of colonial rule and whose minutiae have been documented and remembered in particular ways? Now, the growing literature on photography in sub-Saharan Africa has also focused overwhelmingly on colonial and post-colonial periods, with the camera often conceived, rightly so, as a tool of empire that came with European contact from the second half of the 19th century. And of course, this research has expanded our understandings, especially of the 20th century, the nuances of changing urban subjectivities, of colonial and nationalist projections of modernization and development, plus the dissonances and contradictions within these grander narratives. But as the critical work around photographs continues to grow, I wish to ask whether the methodological possibilities of accessing a more distant African past through this medium are also within reach. And if so, how? So the point is not that photographs necessarily do wondrous things in themselves, but they have a capacity to ask questions and to sometimes demand new relationships between multiple existing materials from the past and what these respectively and collectively afford, which might help us to come at things from new angles. Those materials that originate from actual situations, actual milieu, such as written documents and photographic images, lend historians the possibility of greater degrees of detail, even precision, in summoning up the past. Of course, they are produced through distinctive forms of inscription, and photographs are very much differently figured accounts of the subject matter, as Elizabeth Edwards phrases it. And this is from her recent book, Photographs and the Practice of History. But in distinguishing between different kinds of record, historians often treat them as separate and discrete when they might have been produced within the same milieu and reference very similar things, albeit in different registers. These concurrencies and inflections might have implications that only emerge when all accounts are considered together. During my own research in Southern Africa, for example, I've noticed how people attending a scene and prior to writing up their reports often did a kind of visual note-taking with their cameras, recording very different things that did not necessarily appear in reports, or which elderly spokesmen might not reference when later embarking on oral accounts of what was going down. So not for nothing did Siegfried Kracauer refer to photographs as a first draft of history. Matters permeate between things, sometimes overlapping, sometimes not. On its side, the camera records whatever is in front of it with metrical accuracy. But as Michel Frisot puts it, the photographic image is at the intersection of the physicometric, a data recording system of a quantity of photons, as he puts it, and the biometric, which he puts in parenthesis, the culture-influenced system of human perception. We only have the image with its spatial and temporal attestation inscribed in a universal chronology. Again, I'm quoting Frisot, to try to make sense of what was there. Now, other kinds of recording or retelling, whether written or oral, have temporal lapses, however slight, that filter out what may be deemed unimportant or irrelevant. And Georges Didi Huberman argues, with reference to recent work on the Warsaw Ghetto, that photographs offer a uniquely potent medium that bridges the gulf between contact and distance. Now, this is even as they have their limits, which historians often perceive to be greater than they are. Now, according to Elizabeth Edwards, the nervousness of historians around photos arises because photos offer, I quote, little historical closure. They are radically open-ended and never fully resolved, which is quite suggestive in terms of those post-mortem photographs. Now, in her view, these features, being open-ended and unresolved, are highly productive. And once such anxieties are acknowledged, she argues, the entire engagement with photographs makes such disciplinary practices more self-revealing. I agree with Edwards here that it is not simply about retrieval of the past, though it is about that. We are also forced to confront some of the unacknowledged and debatable practices of the discipline of history itself. Now, most historical practice entails a double operation. On the one hand, and again according to Edwards, historians rely on what is insistently referred to as evidence, which is a legal category connected to provability and traceability, with footnotes and references to indicate from where the originating points come. And I want to stress that such standards of evidence are often adverse for African history. On the other hand, historians also claim to reconstruct the past through their own selection and narrative organization of the materials with which they work. But in fact, it is impossible to reconstruct what we do not know and have not lived through. Did it really happen like this? And to quote Ilko Runia, historical reality is incomparably more absent and incomparably more inaccessible than we like to think. Thus, the constructed nature of all historical writing. This is even as such writing draws on what it calls sources that originate from real situations and milieu, and which lend such processes of construction their possibility of approximating any accuracy. Edwards aptly refers to, I quote, tensions and double partialities of history as construction and history as search for objective fact and explanation. And in the view of Elizabeth Edwards, photographs exemplify these tensions. Now, such arguments, I think, create more of a level ground between the different media that retain traces of the past. But for historians to do justice to photographs and realize their potential, and at risk of going over much well-covered ground with this audience, we need to acknowledge certain other things that photographs have in common with other so-called sources when it comes to the writing of African history. First, any source, whether visual, textual, or oral, is not a fount representing some origin of knowledge despite its name. It is always already an interpretation. In both content and form, however, it often yields something in excess of the intentions of its maker. Secondly, sources cannot be treated as pure and hermetically sealed entities. To a certain degree, as suggested earlier, there can be interpenetration and citation across different media over time, whether oral, written, or visual. They often spill over, relay each other, and reference much of the same thing. Thirdly, and as a result of all this, materials that carry such historical traces do not necessarily respect the rigid periodizations that historians have imposed. Here, therefore, I wish to emphasize the interpenetration of sources and the durability of things surfacing in photographs that come from the more distant past. Periods of early encounter and the initiation of colonial rule are especially dense in this regard. To date, these multiple and overlapping presences have tended to be treated as overwhelmingly colonial and going in a certain inevitable direction. The matter is conceived as inaugurating the end of the pre-colonial. The either-or terminology of periodization, such as pre-colonial/colonial, confines us to a linear conception of time, which shuts down other possibilities. But is this simply a problem of periodization? In his work on the microspatial, another historian, De Vito, looks at the traditional divisions of history and insists that periodizations such as pre-modern and modern are no more than, I quote, visible legacies of the Eurocentric approach. To a glaring degree, this applies to the terms colonial and pre-colonial. And I really feel we need to move beyond these predefined periodizations, as De Vito argues, as he puts it, towards pertinent and even ad hoc periodizations embedded in the research process. This implies not just rethinking, but perhaps unthinking colonialism, and especially its pre-phase, because such predefined understandings effectively partition time and space. Now, I started this talk with the death of Mandume, but I want to go back to earlier groups of photographic images from the region, the Kuvalai floodplain, located in what is now southern Angola and northern Namibia. Now, by the early part of the 20th century, this was a contested region between Portugal, Germany, and several sizable local polities and African kingdoms. During World War I, the Union of South Africa supplanted German interests in the territory. And we're going to move from this Portuguese map from around 1912 to a South African map. If you go to the next slide, Anna. Thank you. Okay, now, especially sensitive was the cartographically disputed border between Angola and what was then Southwest Africa. In fact, it is called, on this map, the neutral zone, because Portugal claimed territory further south and Germany had claimed territory further north because of a geographical confusion around the location of cataracts on the Kunene River, which is over in the west. Right, so this is a very sensitive region. It's disputed, and it was occupied by the well-armed and autonomous kingdoms of Kwamatu and Kwanyama. The neighbor of Kwanyama, I want to start, in fact, with the smaller kingdom of Kwamatu. Next slide, please. I'm reverting now to another Portuguese map. Now, there was a photograph that I've been working with that set me thinking along certain lines. And this photograph originates from a photo album of the Portuguese officer Veloso de Castro, who participated in the 1907 military campaign against Kwamatu. And Kwamatu is known locally as Umbaja. Next slide, Anna. This 1907 campaign against Kwamatu, and this is important, was to avenge an earlier expedition in 1904 that ended in catastrophic defeat and many fatalities at a site called Pembe. So this campaign follows 3 years later. Now, given what Edwards calls the micro levels at which we encounter the past through photographs, as well as the foreshortening of history that occurs by not taking the pre-colonial seriously, can such photos help us think about time differently and expand our spatial sense of these deeper pasts? So one of the figures to emerge from the pages of the 1907 photo album of the Portuguese military expedition to conquer and occupy Kwamatu is a young fighter referred to as Kwamatu Soldier in the album caption and elsewhere. So he's a slight figure standing with his wrists draped over the long barrel of a rifle on his shoulders when he was photographed. Now, his portrait is not only in the album of the photographs, but also in Veloso de Castro's published war memoir. Next slide. Both inside the book and on the back cover. The memoir and album both detail a grueling expedition and campaign. There is some elaboration in the memoir around a particular young Kwamatu soldier with a Snider rifle, whom I believe to be the man in the portrait, which is on the right here. Specifically, Veloso de Castro's account has this figure as one of a number of young soldiers who appeared with their weapons in the last area where there was fighting, called Naluek, after the successful Portuguese occupation. And these soldiers hung around very mistrustfully. As the campaign ended, the soldier joined Veloso's small column on its return to the Portuguese fort at Humbe, where he was arrested. When the main expedition arrived in Humbe, he was actually set free. Veloso de Castro remarks how odd it was that, I quote, having been convinced he would die at our hands, he showed not the slightest gratitude or sign of admiration for our gesture of setting him free. So instead, the narrator saw a sovereign indifference. Now, it's fascinating how this apparently simple photo brings us immediately into a crowded historiography and can be inserted into a range of accounts and multiple archives. But this is not just an empirical thickening, what happened, the causal links, etc. It might also be the moment when new questions and thematics emerge. So first, just some basic questions. How does the photo come to exist? As in other colonial settings, the camera was part of the expeditionary equipment. A career soldier, Veloso de Castro seems to have had considerable experience in Angola, achieving high technical standards and considerable output. He actually made 2 portraits of the Kwamatu soldier, and perhaps it was the subject's quality of aloofness whilst being present that offered something distinctive enough to draw him to portray him with his camera in the first place. It might also be a symptom of the insecurity arising from the seesaw of history for the Portuguese here, from crushing defeat in 1904, one of the worst colonial disasters ever to happen in Africa, to victory in 1907, and therefore a compulsive interest in an enemy, the Kwamatu, who had inflicted so much damage a few years earlier, but who had fought, been defeated, and were now leaderless. The photographic record shows attention to this young man's his dress and his accoutrements as a soldier, which Veloso de Castro also describes in considerable detail in his published memoir. There were his ammunition bits carried on his person, not very safely, he says, and his amulets, but he also wore 2 mecanismos de relógio, which I'm translating as timepieces, which he informed the Portuguese he had collected in 1904 from Pembe. Pembe, as mentioned, was where over 300 members of the previous Portuguese expedition had perished. Next slide. That particular expedition of 1904 had been on its way to invade and occupy the largest kingdom in the region, which was Kwanyama, the neighboring area. But it was ambushed and completely annihilated by the little-known Kwamatu forces. Both Kwamatu and Kwanyama were on the border between territories claimed by Germany and Portugal, though the bigger part of their lands were in Angola. So the 1907 expedition was to avenge this devastating and disgraceful defeat at the hands of a tiny African army as Veloso puts it, an indelible and pungent memory. Its objective was to effect a more substantial presence near the putative colonial border that only existed in theory and hypothetically on maps. Next slide, please. And whose exact latitude was moreover disputed. The expedition of 1907 only had Kwamatu in its sights, stopping well short of trying to occupy the larger kingdom of Kwanyama. And you see from this very amusing map, actually, that there's a disobedient territory here, which is at the bottom on the border, and that is now Kwanyama. Right, now the soldier incorporated the 2 timepieces on his person along with his other accoutrements. Besides lifting these and other objects such as straps, water bottles, rifles, and ammunition from the battlefield at Pembe, he and his comrades had stolen time from the Portuguese. One might even say that in stealing time from colonialism, they disrupted its forceful teleology and pushed back the progress of conquest, obliging the Portuguese to take some years to rebuild the impetus to return again with greater force and smaller ambition. Next slide, please, Anna. One picks up on the discomfort of Portuguese commentators at the hints of surprising parity, their unease at hints of equivalence, at the uncertainty of possible outcomes to their venture. And it should also remind us of the existence of other concepts of time. In her book, The Camera as Historian, which charts the British survey movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Edwards argues that, I quote, "The temporal interjections of photography merge with layers of deep time." This is also apt for Angola, but in quite a specific way. Now, all of us are familiar with the concept of the optical unconscious that Benjamin proposed in relation to the unexpected visibilities that the space of the photograph might yield. But in relation to African history, I've been trying to work with another concept of the unconscious in relation to photographs, a kind of historical unconscious, if you like. And I would say this works at 2 levels when it comes to taking pictures in this epoch. At one level, it is the unnoticed, the contingent, the detail that is not noticed at first, which later provides clues or leakages, however inconsequential. These often emerge in what Chris Morton calls the hinterlands of a photograph. Now, at a second level, these inadvertent recordings are often accompanied and amplified by the unconscious or unthought way of the colonial officer looking at the subject behind the camera, for they might think they know what they see, but in fact, maybe they don't. There's often considerable ignorance in their way of looking. It is solipsistic about their expedition to southern Angola in this case, with some inclusions. For this army, as for other European armies, it's often a function of militarism, masculinity, and whiteness. And this is an argument that Matthias Häusler makes for the German Herero War, which was just ending further south with genocidal results in Southwest Africa. So the Portuguese, I would argue, were largely illiterate in this landscape, but they brought their technological instrumentation to bear in the attempt to attain a sovereign gaze. Such temporal interjections merging with deep time, in fact, enable a degree of, and this is Didi Huberman's term, sovereign accident, producing an ambivalence which merges conscious and unconscious elements that might even be at odds. In southern Angola, photography was part of the larger infrastructure brought by the Portuguese that included the telegraph. Next slide, Anna, please. The camera and the timepiece itself. Next slide, please. The watch or the timepiece was itself an extension of the capacity to measure time that had become diffused across European cities by the early 20th century. This allowed its carrier, as Mary Ann Duane puts it, to be constantly in sight of time. These multiple components constitute not just infrastructure, but an infrastructure of time. We should include here the photo album of Veloso de Castro, for as Marian Hirsch and Leo Spitzer remind us in their book on liquid time, a photo album is supposed to show progressive linear time. In a special issue of the journal History and Theory on Photography and Historical Interpretation, Michael Roth analyzes the way time is segmented into even parts, which are also spatialized. This is sort of in Western Enlightenment thought. Now, this goes beyond simple notions of linear time into a glimmer of realization that chronology relies on equidistant parts, standardized parts that are in equilibrium. Edwards argues that photos do one kind of sabotage to this, which is to bring the distant past immediately close, without calibration of equidistant parts or segments of time. It is, she says, I quote, a graspable reality in a play of closeness and distance. So by ripping this photo out of the expedition album and asking other questions of it, and I'm referring to the photograph of the soldier with the timepieces. So asking other questions of this, what is happening? Now that particular photograph of the soldier, I found it focused the attention. As so often with older photographs, in itself, it does not narrate. And this form of limit is what Didi Huberman conceives as having an important lacunary function. That term is derived from the word lacuna, a limit, an absence, pushing us to mobilize other resources touching on the matter. The subject himself, the soldier, is referred to in a textual narrative stemming from the same milieu. He's not mentioned in any oral narratives, but his theft of time from the Portuguese is a point that takes us directly to another aspect of oral history from the region, which perhaps we should be bold about and call Black Thought. While Portugal was in a race against Germany for the control of southern Angola, the textual narrative of the African lifting of Portuguese timekeeping should alert us to another completely different concept of time that was rooted deeply in this remarkable floodplain environment. And this was a philosophy of allowing things to come to fullness instead of an extractive, speeded up and measured sense of time. Now in 1904, time had changed hands. The timepieces which had measured the beat of a prior expedition that met with catastrophe was then worn in 1907 by a brave young man, like an amulet, consuming the machinic substance of the colonizer and stilling its beat. This was ironic because the timepiece, which allowed its carrier to be constantly in sight of time, was the emblem and prosthetic of a concept of time that is most famously denounced by the incoming Kwanyama king, Mandume Yande Mufayo. Next slide, please, Anna. The new king's view was, however, part of a much more generalized commons, an oral knowledge commons, which held that you did not push things prematurely, you did not do things out of self-interest, but in the interests of the larger community, who needed to eat those things that only ripen in the fullness of time. And there is a powerful metaphor operating in these discourses around eating unripe fruits, which was treated as a crime, where jumping ahead was regarded as greed that put different parties at risk. So in a way, it's against the speeding up of time. Now, German missionaries had been in Kwanyama since 1890, and they also mention this widely held tenet, but it has congealed very specifically in the oral histories around Mandume, who appears in this group photo here with South African officials in 1915. And I think Anna and John will probably recognize it from last week when I spoke about this particular photo. The most detailed elaboration of Mandume's period of rule was offered by the late Reverend Vilho Kaulinge. Next slide, please. In his account, when Mandume came to power in 1911, he set out a number of new laws as part of a policy of internal renovation that drew on very deep precedents. The first of his laws was a prohibition on the harvesting of unripe fruits, especially from the omwandi tree, whose fruit had been increasingly beaten off prematurely during recent droughts. Subjects were under an injunction to respect the process of ripening, to respect the fullness of time, not its speeding up and rearrangement for acquisitive and what the king deemed socially destructive purposes. Europeans had different ways of managing time, and to quote how Edwards puts it, tracing, stilling, holding, bridging, even eliminating time. Such hubris is ultimately constitutive of the Anthropocene, one could argue, but waiting for the fruits to turn is not. Inaugurated as king of Kwanyama in 1911, Mandume's new laws were explicitly phrased by the historian Kaulinge as an undoing of the things his royal uncles had done and permitted, allowing exploitative trade and negotiating with colonial parties. Next slide, please. He wanted to turn the tide, push back time, because Mandume additionally put the brakes on such things as the random firing of guns and conducting raids against neighboring groups without his sanction. This re-centralization of power is also a form of managing time. It signals too that groups were for long already deeply immersed in negotiating a threshold with the agents and artifacts of merchant capital. But as I hope is apparent, my point here is not to find a pristine pre-colonial, but rather connected singularities. The attempt here is to write with a sense of such overlappings and thresholds in ways that carry the different skeins of plural actors and actants. The problem with big terms like colonial is that they make it harder to apprehend plural and minor historical presences, except in rather dichotomized terms. The predefined parameters tend to work across what De Vito calls, I quote, spaces considered as internally homogeneous and mutually isolated. Now, the beautiful point about southern Angola and the floodplain is that it is none of these things. It has a more liquid quality, as it were, with larger and smaller tides of movement where, as another historian, Subramanyam, puts it, historical process develop at the crossroads of multiple local and regional interactions. The invocation or law not to shake or knock the unripe fruit off the omwandi tree until the fruit is ripened and can benefit the many signals a way of being in and with the world that is non-extractive. And I'm using the formulation of John Rico. This is controlled in such a way that it enhances future survival. In a way, people are taking account of biodiversity and ends, because disaster of ecological proportions might not be far off. This is rather haunting when one takes a look at the most recent war in this region for Namibian independence, where the South African Defence Force instituted a 10-kilometer wide scorched earth zone along the entire border of the floodplain. Next slide, please, Anna. Now, the earlier ecological way of being in the world tilts us into a cosmos of African thought that historically stretched across many parts of the continent. Agricultural peoples regularly mark the importance of such a principle in major ceremonies, often called in English the first fruits, when newly harvested food was brought into a center and ritual thanks offered. In major centralized powers such as Asante, likewise the Zulu, Swazi, and other Nguni kingdoms in southern Africa, travelers and officials commented on the spectacular proportions these ceremonies could reach. They also sketched, printed, and photographed them extensively. These might be cases, again, where colonialists know not what they photographed, producing fractured portrayals of quite another infrastructure of time. The invocation of the figure of Mandume in oral accounts, that is a form of witnessing that is not ocular, but auricular, is where the most detail emerges regarding his internal policies from 1911. But there is a cluster of documentation around his period of rule and its end. At the time of the 1907 Kwamatu campaign, missionary accounts inform us that Mandume was still being sheltered from his uncles by his great aunt Nekotu, where Yulu Wahedimbi had signed a treaty allowing mineral exploration and extraction in Kwanyama, which was on an earlier slide. Portuguese accounts record the undertaking by his successor, King Nande Yahedimbi, not to interfere in Kwamatu when the expedition attacked. Next slide, please. Now, Nande, in turn, signed an agreement with the Germans in 1908. So these are the delicate turns of negotiated peace in what we might call the antechamber of colonialism, but where the term antechamber does not have to signify a teleology. Here, thinking of Mandume, the spatial notion of an antechamber rather than temporal is useful, because one gets a sense of the actual sound and vibration of the conquest of your neighbor as if through a thin dividing wall, and it prepares your society, it galvanizes the group to draw on existing resources. That long inception allows us to apprehend some of the more articulated patterns of multiple and combined temporalities. Now, photos were not in what we might call the common world of people in southern Angola at this time. And we are using them later to, as it were, look around the corner of history, or following Runia's work on presence. The photo, for example, of a soldier who took timepieces to wear works like a metonym taken from one context to another and slightly out of place, becoming, I quote, a fistula or hole through which the past discharges into the present. And here we have the contemporaneity of the non-contemporary letting in African thought. As mentioned earlier, the issue of time in the oral accounts I refer to is not just held in a singular text like Kaulinge's. The value accorded to time, and this idea that ripeness is all, was also much more widely disseminated. Historian David Cohen has remarked that we might usefully see such African historical knowledge as, I quote, fully engaged with broader social intelligence, known experience, and manipulated, of which historians' redactions of testimonies are narrowed, selected, privileged pieces. Cohen argues for the power of stories to be evaluated, I quote, by their play and effect in the past and in the present, instead of being extracted and, I quote, reduced into history by the methods of the new African historiography. It seems to me that the different ways this photograph of the Kwamatu Soldier again has time encoded in it resuscitates what has become an entire undercommons. The metaphor of the unripe fruits is at play, and undercommons, which is still being referred to in 2017 at the Centenary Memorial for Mandume. Next slide, please, Anna. And next slide, please. And the next one. Right, so at this commemoration of the centenary of Mandume's death, which was held in Namibia, a number of the speeches referred very directly to the environmental value of what Mandume was so famous for saying about looking after the trees. So it's very much still alive. Now, what I find in working with some of these photos, especially the one of the Kwamatu Soldier, but moving again towards those post-mortem photographs, is that our attention is drawn to some of these larger issues in African thought, not because they are directly narrated by the photograph, but because the act of taking these photographs signals something deeper and wider is going on, and it might actually be a colonial blind spot. It is just conceivable that buried within the photo, for instance, compacted into the hybrid accoutrements worn on the soldier's body from Kwamatu, is an African refutation of universal, measurable notions of empty time. Next slide, please. Now, what else might be going on in Mandume's post-mortem photos, therefore? It is extremely suggestive to examine, as it always is, archival reports, but specifically from the last meeting between Mandume and South African colonial officials, where intelligence officer Lieutenant Hahn was sent to deliver an ultimatum to the king on the 5th of December 1916. So this is 3 months before the military expedition. The problem for the South African officials was that the king had several times crossed the colonial border to restore order among his subjects in Angola and had clashed with Portuguese troops. The resident commissioner, sorry about that, The resident commissioner had noted in his diary that, I quote, "the one great drawback to what could otherwise have been a peaceful, economical, and fully justifiable occupation by our government." And this was, again, I quote, "the unnatural division of the Kwanyama country inhabited by a truculent and bad class headed by a savage despot, and the inveterate hatred by natives against our neighbors, the Portuguese." Next slide, please. The ultimatum had been insisted upon in a numbered and wired directive from Pretoria before the South African government proceeded with the expense of an expeditionary force in February 1917. They required a definite answer from Mandume as to whether or not he would surrender himself voluntarily. Mandume's recorded utterances that he would not move, that he would die defending his land, opened the way for the final authorization of the Ovamboland Expeditionary Force led by Colonel de Jager. Now, a thunderstorm the day before the ultimatum heralded the provision of much needed water and grass for the horses of the South African Mounted Regiment, another matter that preoccupied local officials in assessing the various risks to be faced. This thunderstorm, however, would have been read differently by everyone else. A little note appears among the intelligence reports of some people from another kingdom called Evale in Angola, who were in the vicinity of Mandume's residence a few weeks earlier. While this is reported, doubtless, for security reasons, it is highly possible that Mandume had followed an old practice of sending tribute of a black bull to Evale to petition their rainmaker king for the black clouds that would bring on the rains to allow the planting of crops. At all events, rainmaking had taken place, and this was extremely propitious, promising a fullness of new growth. Once at the prescribed meeting place to deliver the ultimatum, Hahn noted an extraordinary choreography. Figures were flitting in and out of the scrub, the bush around, in and out of his vision. Then 2 shots rang out on either side and Mandume appeared. It was most uncomfortable for the intelligence officer when a theatrical element unfolded, where the people started to imitate and mock the Portuguese who had fled their last encounter. And I quote Hahn's report, "The chief and 6 headmen all treated the Portuguese encounters as a joke, and some contemptuously imitated the way in which the Portuguese had retreated." End of quote. So it would seem that the white man was not to be looked at, his weaknesses seen, and then played back like this. Hahn then commented on the degree of readiness and Mandume's effortless command over his men. I quote, "I was also impressed with the wonderful control he had over his men and the promptness with which any of his orders were carried out." Now, this is building an argument for a military expedition, but at the same time, it reflected a degree of awe. Hahn also noticed the mobility of the men who had accompanied his motor vehicle on foot. I quote, "Some of these men yesterday easily kept pace with the motor car through the bush for a distance of quite 22 miles, carrying their rifles and ammunition. All the people are now in far better physical condition than when they fought the Portuguese in the famine time in 1915. It is reported that Mandume's people have often run down people on horseback in this difficult country with which they are very well acquainted." In effect, Mandume was stealing time and resources from the South Africans, who had other bigger campaigns in German East Africa to undertake as part of the Allied campaign in Africa. But there's something else here. Not all sensory recording and awareness can or should be reduced to the camera. Hans' uneasiness is palpable in his references to the fighters who flit in and out of the scrub, the vegetation, flickering at the edge of his sight. This flickering at the edge of vision of Mandume's scouts and fighters and the frightening fitness of these black men in this difficult country haunted Han throughout his journey and meeting to deliver the ultimatum to Mandume. With their flashing in and out of sight, passing in and out of the bush cover, they posed many uncertainties, anxieties, possibly instabilities. Now, this mode of partial and mobile vision, where the white officer's sovereign position is destabilized and uncertain, goes against the full square, full frontal sovereign vision that determines something like a group photo and similar kinds of records that are also mapping spaces and enacting identification. The slowness of exposure for photography also required a ceremonial stoppage, whereas this mode of seeing is like having bodies in constant flight across an unreadable landscape. These Kwanyama men are seeing and navigating in full movement, attuned to sound and environment all around them. In fact, sound and smell would be very important in guiding their movement, as the whole point is not to be visible. They would have operated with a total sensory mobilization, not a partition of the senses. And I am going to end there. Thank you very much. Last slide, please, Anna. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Patrícia.
Thanks.
Anna, do you want to say something?
No, I think we can do a small break of 5 minutes, okay? Yeah? And then we return with Paulo and Milton, okay?
Okay.
Okay, 5 minutes.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
Muito bom, né, Marcos? Very good.
Excelente, excelente. Essa região que ela trouxe é uma região, ela falou, né, contestada pelos portugueses, e é impressionante que no centenário da fotografia, eles colocam como o primeiro daguerreótipo produzido em Portugal ser dessa região.
Ah, olha só.
Eu estou trazendo isso lá na... Enfim, você vai ler em algum momento. E aí tem uma discussão se não parece não ser um daguerreótipo, se é apenas uma ilustração. Enfim, tem um debate interessante ali. Que é a princesa de Willa. Balboa, a princesa de Willa.
Tem uma dúvida sobre a materialidade, né? Sobre essa imagem. Quer dizer, meio que roubar o estatuto de ser fotografia, né?
É isso aí.
Né?
É muito interessante, assim.
É envolvente, né?
E, assim, não sei se você... Gente, eu fiquei muito chocado com as fotos dele morto, assim. Aquelas ossadas ali... Eu quase chorei vendo aquelas ossadas.
Aquelas ossadas são muito, muito pesadas, né?
Muito pesada. Muito, muito. Enfim.
E a gente no Brasil, que tem essa dimensão ossada pós-ditadura, tem outro impacto também, né? Assim, porque a gente nunca vê desse jeito, né? Assim.
Sim, é uma coisa horrorosa. Assim. Tem muito
mobilizado, né? Também achei. Super grata por vocês terem trazido ela. Incrível.
Oh, Patrícia is a great reference for us here in the studies of photography. It's important, especially because Patrícia deals with the oral history, oral tradition, and it's really connected what we've been doing in our laboratory. Marcos, the stage is yours now. You can go and present Paulo.
Yes. In this change, we invite two debaters to talk with us about the reflections made by Patrícia Hayes. They are the Professor Paulo Knauss and Milton Guran. I present the Paulo after I will present the Milton, okay? Paulo Knauss is a professor in the Department of History of the Universidade Federal Fluminense. His research examines the relationships between art, image, and visual culture, as well as history, memory, and cultural heritage. He was a director of Museu Histórico Nacional and Arquivo Público do Estado do Rio de Janeiro. He is the author of a number of book chapters and journal. His more recent works is the book História do Rio de Janeiro em 45 Objetos, that he was co-editor and co-author, and the exposure Imagens que não conformam at Museu de Arte do Rio de Janeiro. Paulo. Microfone, Paulo.
Thank you, Marcos, for introducing, for the introduction. Ana Maria, thank you very much for the invitation. It's always great to be among friends and colleagues, especially in this occasion to hear and meet again Patrícia. Almost in 1.5 months, it will be exactly 20 years ago that we met in Cape Town. It was, for me, it was a really remarkable occasion because short before my trip, maybe a few months before, I read your other book, the Colonizing Camera, which is a wonderful book, and for me it was very really meaningful because it was my introduction to the history of photography in Africa, and I remember very well my feelings during the reading of this book, which is for me one of my most important books in my studies. especially because of the inspiration that it gave it to me at that time. And I remember very well that my trip to South Africa, I've met you, and then I met also Sean Field of the Cape Town University, that was coordinator of the oral history project of Western Cape, and was really two meetings that for me were very important, especially because although the history of Brazil and the history of South Africa are totally different in different ways, I was amazed about this historical approach, especially to the sources, the sources of the historical sources about South Africa, and I would say that was quite close to what we were trying to develop and do in our country at our research group, the Oral History and Image Laboratory, especially because I think the way somehow photographs for you, but I would say also in Brazil, although they are documents, it's quite as a historian, we have it's difficult to accept just the statues of monuments of the photographs. At the same time, as historians, we have to look to these photographs, especially of 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, as monuments of I would say colonizing gaze, and this ask, I would say, this critical approach of the historical view. Well, Patricia, I appreciate a lot your paper, of course, and I've read also the book, the ambivalent photographs and visibility of Africa, especially your article on the chapter you in the book, and I was really amazed, especially because of the story itself, the history of the king, the history of Namibia, South Africa, and Angola. It's great to see how also this kind of diaspora of collections and archives, that it's the research field you have to work, and this is something also I would say is very close to the Brazilian experience, also this diaspora of archives and collections, especially when we speak about photographs. But something that is still very important for my my way of thinking about images, I think, especially this book, in this new book about ambivalent photographs, I think the question about intertextuality, the fact that reading images needs also to go with reading other kind of documents. It's quite, I would say, highlighted in this new book and in your actual talk. The question of intertextuality on historical research, I guess, is really something that the studies we do, it's quite significant for the historical research, because in a way especially in our case, I would say our research group, when it's founded 40 years ago, and 4 decades ago, by other professors that came before us, I would say they looked after, this first generation, looked after photographs like searching for new information, more dates about the facts they already knew about, that they knew about the textual, the traditional historical documents. And especially in your paper, the chapter you wrote for the book, Ambivalent Photographs, I noticed, which is for me something very original, you, at the same time that your research is based on this dialogue of different kind of sources and mediums, you stress also the lacunary function that you want to stress in this approach of the documents. In this sense, I would say you go beyond this idea that we have to recollect more and more documents, to have more and more information, and you put the highlights on the idea that this lacunary function illuminate the structures of the media and of texts and images. I would like to hear you more about this. I mean, for me, it's clear this intertextual effort, bring different kinds of documents and mediums together, cross them, and made this one of the strategies for the historical research. But I would like to ask you how you, at the same time, it's interesting because in the book, the first paragraph, if I'm not wrong, you talk about the fact that there is a field of excess of images about Africa. Then, when you read the chapters, it's clearly that you go beyond the images. In all chapters, we have this approach to the oral tradition, textual documents in general. But on your chapter, you talk about these lacunary functions that illuminates the structuring of the media, text and images. I would like to hear you a little bit about that, because as far as I could follow, this is part of the idea of this ambivalent photographs, that at the same time they are part of an excess, a field of excess of images, but you stresses exactly the idea of the lacunary function of this medium. So I would like to hear you a little bit about that, because I guess it is something very interesting for all of us, but especially for our students, because in fact, I would say as close in the time we work on, we have more images. And there's always the idea that a lot of images, it's a kind of it's guarantee a rich research. And in your case, you put you stresses exactly this idea of lacunary function. So I would like to hear a little bit about this idea of lacunary function of the media, and how this goes together with the idea of the excess of images about African history. Thank you, Patricia. I'm very glad to see you again, hear you. I really appreciate to be here in this occasion, and thank you especially to Anna and Marcos to be part of this dialogue. And I'm looking for hearing also what Milton is going to say. It's also a very close colleague and friend. Thank you.
Let's go to Milton, or Patricia, you rather answer Paulo?
I think let's take more questions. Perhaps let's go to Milton. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So I will present Milton. Milton Guran is an anthropologist and photographer. He is associate research at Laboy and author of Agudais, os Brasileiros do Benin, and Linguagem Fotográfica e Informação, among other titles. He is director and general coordinator of Foto Rio, Encontro Internacional de Fotografia do Rio. He was a member of the International Scientific Committee of the UNESCO Slave Routes Project and coordinator of the research sub-project, os 30 anos de contato dos araras, cachoeiras secas, por eles mesmos, and the project salvaguarda de línguas indígenas fronteiriças at Museu do Índio, UNESCO. Milton.
Thank you, Marcos, for this presentation. Well, first of all, do you hear me properly? Yeah? First of all, I would like to thank Ana Maria Mauad for this invitation and Marcos for the presentation, and say that it's for me a great pleasure and an honor to be here with Patrícia Hayes, as well as Paulo. I was very impressed with the book Colonizing Camera. It teach me a lot about photography history and colonialism. And Patrícia Hayes is, for all of us, one of the most important references in what concerns that photography, memory, colonialism, and history. So, and also I have the opportunity to meet Patrícia some years ago, and I also was very impressed for the person of Patrícia, and this marks me a lot. So to be here with you, you all, and Patrícia in particular, is very appreciated very much. It's very grateful for me to be among the colleagues, and also Rui Assugi, who is a very important Mozambique photographer from Mozambique. Well, I would like to say that I just take all the words of Paulo Knauss to be mine as well, because I agree absolutely with all he said, but I would like to underline that was very, how can I say, but if we put, the subject is very important. What you show us is very important. But for me, particularly, I think that the most important lesson that I can take for your talk is about methodology, because you show us that what we can see in a photo, as well as in any historical document, depends on the question that you put to the document. But you just show us how important is also to pay attention to the question that the photo puts itself. This is very important. I know that's it's very knowing that Cartier-Bresson, the great French photographer, said that a photo also puts a question. And what you highlight in your talk is that the question the photo puts only can be answered with a dialogue with the other source, other historical source. And what touched me a lot, that you, in a way very clear, we have taken us, our hands, and you drive us to find the answers in dialogue of other historical sources. That is what I would like to highlight of your explanation, because this is a very simple method, but a very important method to understand photo as a historical source and use it, and also to understand how the colonialists used photos to stretch their policies and the way they want to submit the other peoples. Also with the importance of the technology, because photograph was a technology as important as the technology we have today in a war sense. So I don't have a question really. I just want to highlight the importance of the method you present to us, and I will let my colleagues go on and ask the question. Thank you, Patrícia. You have taken our hands, and it was a very, very interesting promenade. There's another thing that I would like to highlight, is that you present to us. I don't know how to say in English, but the état des lieux, about all this discussion of photography as a historical source, and as well, you show us an overview, a panorama of the discussion about it, about the subject, and you present the reference that we work always with. And this was also an aspect very important of your talk, of your presentation, and I thank you for that as well. You just put us up to date about the discussion about photo and history and memory and how to use it in understanding colonialism in other politics way. Thank you, Patrícia, for that, and next up is that. Thank you.
I think we can let John do the last question, and then we have three sets of questions, and then we give the stage to Patrícia, okay?
Okay.
John, please, open your microphone.
Well, can you hear me now? Yeah. Well, Patrícia, a wonderful talk again, and lovely to hear you again shortly after the Congress of the International Network of History Theory. A couple points. One, I think you would find interesting the photograph of Charlemagne Perrault in Haiti in 1919. If you just go to Wikipedia and look Haiti up, you will find he was executed by the U.S. Marines, and they published his photo of him executed, and it caused exactly the opposite response of what they had thought it would cause. And I don't know much about the case, but I found the photo many years ago, and I was delighted to see it reproduced on Wikipedia. Yes, of course, the historical unconscious. I'm blown away when I find photos of properties of Dallas Cowboys here in Mexico. T-shirts about U.S. football teams. Nobody sees them. The watches I thought was fascinating. One wonders if he really wound them up so that he could tell time, or if they were only right twice a day, since nobody else understood time. I love the idea of ripeness is all, the idea of fullness, and it made me think of the slow movement. I don't know if any of you have heard of the slow movement, but there's a book called The Slow Professor. And the whole idea is, let's slow all of this down. Finally, for the students, you will find in the book that Ana Maria and I did on Fotografía y Historia in America Latina about exactly absences and lacunae, the absences in the archive of the United Fruit Company in Colombia, the absences of the strike by the bananeras. But I thought a wonderful talk, and it certainly reminded us that the process of colonization is never linear. It's always negotiation and renegotiation. In Mexico, of course, we lived it for 400 years. And if you study Mexican colonial history, it's all a process of negotiation and renegotiation. But thank you so much. Great talk.
Thank you, John. Patricia, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much to Paulo and Milton and John. And how wonderful to revive our conversation from last year and 20 years ago. Let me just, I think I'll go backwards and speak to John first. I will check out this Wikipedia site. I'm very interested in what you say and the effects of publishing a photograph like this. I think that sounds a really interesting example. I suspect that the notion of ripeness is all, and this entire philosophy probably has a lot in common with the slow movement. John, I always find it really interesting when very contemporary movements suddenly find a spark that actually is very familiar to people from a long time ago. I think there's much in what you say. I don't know whether that young soldier actually was rewinding the watches. I think he repurposed it for his own, they were repurposed for his own use. And I want to think further about the sort of hybridization of the accoutrements and the way, there's all these fellow technologies going on. There's the time measurement, there's the telegraph, there's the camera, and they're all doing different things. And it's very interesting that the main reason why the Union of South Africa invaded Namibia in 1915 was because they were requested by the British to take out the German telegraph system in the capital city to interfere with the shipping lanes. And that's how they ended up occupying the country. So I think there's a lot to think there around technology. Now, you mention your book on Latin America with Ana Maria here, and I am very sorry I have not yet got my hands on it, and I'd very much like to do that. And I'm wondering if we're really talking about the same thing with lacunae, because when you talk about absences, I'm assuming that the United Fruit Company wanted, they would have sanitized their archive by removing problematic items that they did not want the public to actually to see, probably related to labor problems. So that does create absences, and I'm very aware of how careful one needs to be with terminology when we're trying to think with concepts like the lacunary function, which Paulo is touching on and pushing me to try to answer satisfactorily, which of course is very challenging. So I don't know if removals of certain contents from an archive constitutes, they would be lacunary in certain ways. However, let me jump to Paulo's set of questions now. So I guess a starting point for us here, Paulo, in Southern Africa is that we, and it'd be very interesting to hear about Brazil and the photographic archives in Brazil, but in a place like South Africa, we have immense, we have substantial collections of photographs dating from already, probably the 1860s. And you talk about the association of earlier bodies of photographs with the colonizing gaze, and this is very much the case. So institutions which have collected photographs, like our national museums, our national libraries, national archives, it's actually a real problem for us in teaching at the university and trying to get our students interested in working with photographs as part of the melange of sources we want to mobilize for for writing and reimagining histories in different ways. So if you've got vast bodies of ethnographic photographs, many of which the purpose was physical anthropology, it's something that many of our students are really understandably very allergic to. Okay, they don't want to engage with it. Often you've just got an ethnic group mentioned, no individuals, etc. It's very objectifying. It's very, very, very problematic and even very painful. And if you, this really struck me very forcibly, not only teaching, but also when you go to conferences in places like Europe, Western Europe, for example, and you hear what kinds of photographs are the visual legacy of those countries, which are celebrating very different things. And we don't have much to celebrate from what we hold in our collections. So, and there is an excess of those kinds of images, right? So this problem is what started me off in the thinking that I develop in the chapter that is an ambivalent, that excess might be a symptom of other things going on that are not necessarily obvious. And I've become quite attached to this notion of a kind of, I guess the most accurate well, a colonial unconscious, a kind of solipsism and unawareness that as one is wielding the camera, you don't actually know what is going on. And now, various students and scholars have done exercises where you take old photographs back to the so-called communities where they come from, which is often very difficult. And there's one chapter in Ambivalent that's quite interesting because Napanduwe Shiweda took back a collection of photographs by a famous South African photographer, Alfred Duggan Cronin, and people, she knew where to go. She did her PhD research on a particular area where it had been a photographic hotspot under colonialism. And she was able to identify family members and they could comment. And the very interesting thing was the different reading that they could give so that it no longer was unidentified people in an ethnographic collection, but actual people who had foibles and characteristics that people remembered and they were related to them. Also very interesting is that in ethnographic photographs, often people are wearing clothes because the whole point is that people are photographed in so-called traditional dress. But often the clothing items that they have can include items that might be sewn into the leather or the cloth that actually carry a great deal of meaning and in fact are a vehicle for the pre-colonial to come into the colonial. So I've been trying to encourage our students and scholars more widely to try to engage with those bodies of very difficult photographs in new ways. And a very inspiring example for me recently was to meet with an Australian Aboriginal researcher called Michael Aird. I've met him a few times, but he's been involved in a new project where he's managed to collect as many studio photographs of Aboriginal people in a part of Queensland in Australia from the 1860s onwards. And he's been able to identify every single one of them and their lineages and their relationships, and also where they moved. And he's done that by locating the studios. And in that sense, he's then able to challenge weaker research that is going on around native land claims in Australia. So I'm answering you in a very long way, but it's just to say that I think in colonial terms, excess is very symptomatic. I think the excess of photographs of Mandume's dead body is a symptom of, is somehow speaking to white insecurity. Now, the lacunary function is a very useful idea that, of course, is developed somewhat in Didi Huberman's book, Images in Spite of All, where he's got a tiny number of photographs from Auschwitz that he is trying to position so that, you know, he's refusing versions of those photographs that have been cropped. He's insisting on the original. He's looking at the information around the frame, even the black spaces, to tell him something about the position of the photographer and what the underground was trying to do by getting a camera into Auschwitz. And very interestingly, in that book, he says that actually historians are very lazy. They don't want to engage with aesthetics. And he also says that people who work with aesthetics don't have enough respect for history. So it's an attack on both sides, which is really useful. And because those photographs that he talks about are so few and so limited, causing museums to blow up details and crop them and try to get more out of them, something more effective out of them. He insists that it's their limitations that then are, they give you a tiny fragment, but they're not giving you, well, what does he say? He says they're giving you the truth, but they are not giving you the whole truth. And so it's that kind of impetus that then you need to engage and do as much research as possible, which then leads us to what you were saying about the need for, Milton put it as a dialogue with other kinds of materials and sources. So what I find very interesting about photographs and their limits is the way it's the organization of time and space in the space of the photograph, and it really brings you in a very angular way into, and it actually disrupts the normative way we think about history. And it kind of makes you pause. And here I want to actually make not a complaint, but well, yes, I do want to complain. I was trying to put together a book which is about a much longer period of Namibian history and this northern area. But because of these photographs, I've had to slow down and talk about individual ones or little batches of them, because I found them so demanding. And I like the way Milton posed the question of what is the question posed by the photograph? So they put you in a quandary, and I think that is something about the structuring of the photograph. It can be very frustrating, but then it makes you realize something. It makes it easier to try to analyze the structuring of textual documents. It means you cannot take for granted, how you work with other kinds of materials anymore, because you need to ask the same questions about everything that you do about the photograph. For instance, how do they organize space and time? What are their narrative or non-narrative characteristics? What's symptomatic about an excessive amount of certain kinds of information, and so forth. So I really think that, and the lacunary function it's a very challenging concept, which one is still sort of thinking about and working with in different ways. But what I like about it is that it's not just about lacunae, because that is assuming that you have parts that will make a whole. They're not just gaps. They are wholes that perform a function. They're a record of something. And you know, I think those questions are very helpful. Perhaps I should stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. Are you engaged to stay a little bit more with us, or because I think we can go for another round of questions. What do you think? It's okay? Okay. I think we have a question here. Sibeli, do you want to open your microphone and do your question, or you want me read your question?
Oh, you can read, or I can read.
You can read. Oh, please. Okay.
All right. Good morning for all. Patricia, in your book, Ambivalent, edited by you and Gary Minkley, it's a very good book. You use the concept of ambivalence to rethink classifications, genealogies, and methodologies in study on photography in Africa. In the specific case of the images you presented, you state in the book that there is also a strong tendency to refuse photographs like those you have described to us as a part of the ethnographic and disempowering knowledge production of colonialism. My two questions are, how more recent studies enable other ways of understanding this kind of visual documents? And how to think about ambivalences in this type of archive that you presented to us. Thank you very much.
Any other question? Ana Carolina? Ana Carolina is here. He's a wonderful researcher about photography in Africa, and also Marcos. So if you want to take advantages of Patricia here, you are with the reference here. And please open your microphone.
Thank you, Anna. Yeah, Patricia, it's always a pleasure to hear you and see you talk about photography, African history. But I was always like, during your presentation, think more about the discussion about space and time to photographs. Like it's idea that I think it's very useful because we can think about it's in the same photograph we can see multiple times, or when we work with like a lot of photographs, like what I'm trying to do now, like have a huge amount of photographs and how to see a common time or different relations. But anyway, I don't have a specific question, but I would love to hear more about this discussion about time and space and photographs. Thank you so much, Anna and Marcus, also for putting everything together and bring Patricia.
I think I have a question, Patricia, and I would like to thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. And I think you raise, as Milton said, you put in perspective the historiography of photography and what we've been thinking about. The way to deal with this lacunary characteristic of photographs, not touching in terms of what is missing, but what we need to understand in what is missing. I think the idea has to do with this. But I'd like to listen to you a little bit more about this idea to go beyond the colonial gaze and go to the pre-colonial. I think for our students that are working with photograph in colonial context, as Marcus, we've been working in this idea of colonial context in order to understand the social circuits of photography, the uses and functions. But then you bring us another perspective. Let's go back and see what's going on before this camera arrived there. And I think it has to do with the categories of even anthropology are using. For instance, I have a great discussion in the INTH because they were calling the South Africans, the ethnical groups as indigenous people. And I'm always arguing, why are you calling them indigenous people if they have their own way of calling themselves? So this is a way of categorizing through Occidental categories the people that are there before the Occidentals, or we arrive, before camera arrive. Ariela Zulay has been, in her last book, she went back to the discovery of America from Columbus to organize how we frame the people that we don't know. So I think you were going in a different way than Ariela Zulay, but I would like to listen what do you think about this and develop a little bit more about this idea. Thank you again so much. Later I have an invitation for you.
Thank you to all of you for these questions. And there's quite a lot on the table. So let me start. Is it Sibele? With your question about ambivalences in the archive, including amongst those very difficult ethnographic archives. And I think you're actually putting that very nicely, because I think that the archives, of course, as many of us know, they have surprises. And, you know, we talk about the categories that are imposed. And I think one of the interesting ways that researchers start to stumble on the interesting bits is when something is in a collection, but it doesn't quite fit the category. And it doesn't belong. Okay, so it's kind of, and then that might actually cause you to start asking the right questions about the category itself. Okay, so I think those things are very useful, and we were so busy in the book Ambivalent working on our various different chapters and, you know, our particular passions, that we never thought of an overarching idea of ambivalences in the archive. So you've put that actually really in a really wonderful way. And one of the things I learned in the process of doing that book with my colleagues was that ambivalence is not simply having mixed feelings about something, that you feel one way and then you feel another way and you're not fully sure about something. Ambivalence is actually about the coexistence of a range of things that might not be in agreement, and they are all there together, playing themselves out. Some of them might be conscious, some of them might be unconscious, and that's a very useful starting point. I think that if we in South Africa developed our research on the ethnographic photographic archives, we could probably contribute to the research on land reform in this country very significantly, because we might be able to locate people in terms of space with a degree of precision, and, you know, therefore using photographs in a very almost legalistic way that I think would create quite an interesting politics. So that's one of the ways I would like us to go. just for the sake of our interest, there's a very large body of anti-apartheid photography in this country. And we actually have a special category of archives that we call liberation archives. And a lot of the photographs from the anti-apartheid struggle are also very unpopular with the younger generation. Black and white photographs of social conditions and suffering and so on. And those are the photographs that kind of educated the world about the problems of apartheid. And a lot of our young people really do not like them. They're almost as unpopular as ethnographic. So that's a really interesting problem as well. I'm really interested in what we have not yet seen in those documentary photos that take it away from just being the portrayal of Black poverty and misery and so on. So I really believe in pushing archives and putting pressure on them in ways that they start to, open up with new possibilities. Now, Anna Carolina, on the space and time in photos, I'm just thinking, because we've spoken about your project and how you are engaged in research with bodies of photographs from the former German colonial empire in Africa, and you're looking at commercial photographers and, as I suspect, big genres, lots and lots of photos in certain genres, because that would have had a market. And it's if you've only got a few photographs, one can really go deeply into thinking of, this question of the space and time of the photos. But one of the things I notice when you work with vast numbers of huge scales of photographs is that another kind of methodology kicks in, and I'm not sure if, Paulo, you have also found this to be the case, that sometimes you need to look at hundreds of photos which have a sameness to them, but if you look at enough of them, you start to see interesting differences emerging. And that starts to tell you something about the space and time of certain photographs. And I recently did a paper about street photographs in South Africa from the anti-apartheid period. I was trying to get away from the usual trend in studying the sort of documentary photographs from the anti-apartheid struggle, where you talk about photographers and the organizations and, the purposes and the philosophies. I wanted to do a big theme. And so I've been collecting street photographs. Of course, almost everything is happening in the street. And I realized that with huge numbers of photographs, they start revealing things you haven't thought of before, as you notice patterns emerging across batches of them. That might be a way to read large numbers of photos. And then, Anna, you asking me to say more about going in the other direction towards the pre-colonial. And it's very hard to stop people talking about the colonial and the pre-colonial. And of course, many of us of my generation were raised in a time of post-colonial theory. But I really do have a concern that we are left with nothing but the colonial in all of this. That is the only category, and nothing happens until that is beginning. And I know that there's a risk with these photographs that I'm looking at that are a sort of, they are overlapping projects of the old pre-colonial kingdoms with the colonial incursions, and a give and take, much as what John is describing for Mexico as well. But I think it really is a foreshortening to just deal with it as colonial, because that puts in place a whole set of priorities in our analyses, and it's like the bad news has come. It's just the bad news. And even if you can open up some tiny little details that allow a flicker of insight into, what I'm calling black thought, I think it somehow just it gives us a little bit more. There's a historian of Ghana actually who says that to only study the colonial period in Africa is like standing on a railway platform and getting on the train, the colonial train, when it arrives, and then going off on the line. Whereas that's not actually doing justice to the possibilities of what has come before. So yes, I think it's very important. I also think that certainly in African history, we can't understand the post-colonial very well unless we have a greater sense of pre-colonial. I really believe that. I think the undoing of the undermining and erosion of certain colonial structures, and the appearance of new formations within post-colonies, I really think we need to understand more about pre-colonial social organization, worldviews, cosmologies, and yeah. But so just to finish, Anna, these are directions we want to go in, and it's very encouraging and beautiful to hear that these are very live questions also for you in Brazil. And just to say that it would be really wonderful to try to have more conversations about this and even collaborate if that's possible. So let me just put my hand up in favor of further communication like this. It's really wonderful. Thank you.
We want to thank you, Patrícia. It was great to have you here. I think we can. Marcos, you can say a few words now.
No, I thank you so much. Your presentation, your communication today is wonderful. I like so much to listening and to her today. And no, thank you. So thank you.
Yeah, sure, Patrícia. I think we have actually it's not a starting point, but we are recontacting our network and South, and I think it's very important, especially because we have so many students and so many researchers doing research about Africa and Africa diaspora. So I think we have a deal. And I later I will send you an email, because I have a special invitation. Maria do Carmo Rainho is here too. We are organizing a special dossier for the National Archive journal, and we'd like to invite you to present an article for us. It can be in English. You can because we publish in English, Spanish, and also I think it's very important. It's a special issue about Marcos Ferrez, who's a a photographer here in Brazil, but also the second part of the title is photography as experience. So I think what you showed us is very important for the notion of photography as an experience. And I think your contribution, and I hope you can accept it. Later I will write you more specific, but anyway, it's a public invitation, and we'll be delighted to have you here as a kind of new starting point for our important network that we are going to build from this year on, even though no, I won't say about anything about politics because I don't want to be upset. But I'm very hopeful. So thank you so much. Thank you for everyone who is here. Thank you, Milton. Thank you, Paulo. Thank you, John, and our colleagues, Inês, Mariana, Yara. I won't name anyone more. Oh, Silvio, who is also a very important researcher in Africa in photography, organizing. They organized a book in Portugal about photography and archives. I think we have a wonderful group, and I invite everyone for the next session that we are going to announce in the field during this month. And I will let you know, Patrícia, maybe I will confirm with Elizabeth Edwards, but we invited her to give the next conference for us. And I think it would be lovely if you were here with us too, so we can we can put this conversation closer. Okay,
that would be wonderful.
Yeah, I will let you know if she. I will confirm with her, but I will let you know anyway. You were invited to all our sections. Anyone want to say anything else? Milton, please.
No. Let's say that it was a pleasure and it was a very good meeting. And I'm looking forward to the next one.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Patricia. Thank you, Marcos. Thank you all. Milton, as always, very good to be with you. And I'm looking forward to the next session, especially Elizabeth Edwards would be great for our studies. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia, again. And
thank you. Thank you, Marcos. Thank you, Ana Maria. Thank you.
So
bye-bye.
See you all. Take care. Bye-bye.
E aí, amiga?
Deu certo, né?
Deu certo, né? Eu acho que deu super certo. Eu acho que a gente pode manter esse para a próxima, Ana. Ver quem pode ser os debatedores.
Para a próxima pode ter, porque, olha, foi 2h30 aqui. Né? Então, a gente
eu acho que isso funcionou e a gente explora bastante os conceitos, né? Sabe uma coisa que eu ia... gravando aí, termina aí parei de gravar.
Vou parar de gravar, interromper a gravação.
Sabe por quê? Sabe o que eu ia